Good morning, everyone. I'm Karina Hill, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, we want to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Dropping Anchor, Supporting Continuing Recovery and Overdose Prevention During the COVID-19 Pandemic with Gabriela Zapata-Alma. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse, Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and myself by using the Q&A or chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them, and the presenter will address them as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and calling using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording of materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 30 business days. One helpful hint is the archived video displays what looks like to be an error message, but it's only a delay buffer, so you want to just ignore it, hit play, and enjoy. To access the recording of PowerPoint, you will go to www.fada.org and our Resource Center Training Library. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 5 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Thursday, May the 7th, 2020. 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Note please that WebEx does monitor your arrival and departure of attendees, and it provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to offer partial credit. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Gabriela Zapata-Alma. She is the Director of Policy and Practice for Domestic Violence and Substance Use at the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma and Mental Health, as well as faculty at the University of Chicago. Gabriela brings 15 years of experience working with people living with HIV/AIDS impacted by housing instability, substance use disorders, and mental health conditions, as well as survivors of domestic violence and other trauma, providing direct services, training, and advocacy, and consultation and leading programs using a trauma-informed approach, motivational interviewing, harm reduction, gender-responsive care, housing first, and third wave behavioral interventions. Gabriella has provided technical assistance through SAMHSA and other national leaders in best practices. Gabriella has been recognized with numerous awards, including Health and Medicine Policy Research Group's 2018 Health Award and the Illinois Association of Addiction Professionals chapter of NADAAC's 2017 Rising Star Award. Gabriella has provided training and technical assistance related to serving marginalized communities impacted by trauma and other socially detriment of health locally, nationally, and internationally. And now I would like to welcome our presenter, Gabriella. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction and for having me here today. So just moving over to the slides. Oh, do we need to, let's see, switch the slide deck?
Now, do you see them, Gabriella?
No, I'm only seeing the standard intro slides.
Is everyone else seeing them? Let's see. Let's go back.
Yeah, we still see the intro slides. There we go.
Here it is. Found it. Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. So here we are. Today's topic is dropping anchor, supporting continuing recovery and overdose prevention during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so here's my contact information. There'll be a slide again at the end. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll also be answering questions throughout the presentation. There may be times that I may hold questions towards either the midway point or the end just to make sure that we get through all the material, but please feel free to enter your responses and your thoughts, and I'll do my best to keep up with them. And then here's information about our center. So the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is the only FIPSA-funded special issue resource center dedicated to addressing the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. We have an array of training and technical assistance resources. We also conduct research and evaluation, policy development and analysis, and public awareness. And then here is my government disclaimer that the things that I say do not necessarily reflect the points of view of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And here at the center, our work is really informed by as well as rooted within our integrated framework. So rooted within survivor-defined approaches, that people are the expert on their own lives and know what they need and what will work best for them. That healing is really born out of physical and emotional safety and relationship and connection, and that all of this makes it possible to foster hope and resilience. And that really from being rooted within this, then we use trauma-informed approaches, human rights and social justice-based approaches that have an awareness and responsive to cultural, historical, and community context, and that we also come from a domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy framework, which is an empowerment and social justice framework. So our learning objectives for today. We're going to become familiar with how the current pandemic can increase risk factors for both returning to substance use as well as accidental overdose. We're also going to increase awareness of how these risks are compounded by interruptions in access to our usual sources of recovery support. And then from there, we're also going to look at what can we do about it. So we're going to cultivate innovative strategies and resources to respond to these increased risks within the constraints of the current pandemic. So first, looking at storms brewing, increasing risks and reduced resources for people living with substance use disorders. So first, I want to hear from all of you. What are some of the increasing risks you've seen in the current pandemic for people living with substance use disorders? What are some of the risks you're noticing? And I'll give you time to go ahead and think about it, think about what you're seeing, and enter your responses in the chat. And then I'll read some pieces out loud since I know you're not able to see one another's, what you put in the chat. So I know in hearing from several syringe service programs, I've heard about syringe service programs seeing a lot of new people coming in for services, and the thought that many people may be returning to substance use and having increased relapse, and that's why they're seeing some new kind of faces at the syringe service program. Increased depression and job loss. No respite time, so no time to really for that restoration, for that self-care, self-nurturing. Absolutely increased stress. And that the stress is really complex and chronic, that it's ongoing, and there's a lot of different sources of stress. Being unable to connect with family and other support, our recovery supports. We know that recovery does not happen usually in isolation. That happens in community. The lack of a clear end. At this, there's so much uncertainty, and it's just kind of ongoing and ongoing. And, typically we think, okay, we can kind of get through most things if we know when it's going to end. We know it's just for this next week, it's just for this next month, but that there's really no clear timeline or resolution for this. The lack of physical contact, that we are social creatures, that we are based in connection. And so something as simple as not really being able to hug our loved ones. The sense of chaos, the disruption to normal life, that we're all going through different stages of grieving, and that there are many things that and people that we're grieving, but there's also this sense of ambiguous loss, of just the loss of what it means to have kind of our sense of normality. And the stress of not being able to meet our basic needs due to job loss. We know that substance use disorders can be really driven by the lack of access to basic needs. And too many people in a closed environment, absolutely. So we have folks who are experiencing either intense isolation. On the other hand, we have folks who may be, experiencing kind of overcrowding and not be able to kind of have some of that just that sense of normal kind of going through the day of distancing and then coming back together. And so how really all of our kind of normative routines have become interrupted. And the loss of friends and family, loss of emotional and or physical support, absolutely. And that all of this can also result in experiences of loneliness and can contribute to depression. And we know that there is a connection with our internal emotional states and the use of substances and the recovery from substances. So thanks so much, everyone. So I'm moving forward. First, there are complex health risks that are related to substance use and respiratory health. So COVID-19, part of the complications is being a respiratory infection. And there are many substances, as well as the ways that we use substances, that can really reduce, or I should say, can really increase the vulnerability of our respiratory health. So in addition to all the increased sources of risk and stress that come with this pandemic, there are also increased health risks related to living with a substance use disorder. So thinking specifically about smoking or vaping and lung health. So either current smoking or vaping or history of smoking or vaping can lead to decreased ability for our system to respond to infection, and may have contributed to pre-existing conditions such as, COPD and other kinds of respiratory health concerns. And that these are all considered risk factors if someone does become ill with COVID-19. Then also looking at opioid use and respiratory health. And here I quote NIDA 2020 here, quote, "People who use opioids at high doses medically or who have an opioid use disorder face separate challenges to their respiratory health, end quote. And so here, keeping in mind that opioid use doesn't necessarily have to be an opioid use disorder, just opioid use as part of one's medical care can also present a risk factor as it relates to the concerns that are raised if one does become ill with COVID-19. So there can be harmful decreases in oxygen, which is also a common COVID-19 symptom, and that this ultimately can lead to damage to the brain as well as increased risk for accidental overdose. And then looking specifically at methamphetamine use that we know unfortunately has been increasing in recent years in Florida. So methamphetamine use and lung health. Methamphetamine constricts the blood vessels, which is one of the properties that contributes to pulmonary damage and pulmonary hypertension in people who have a history of methamphetamine use. And that, of course, this also can lead to complications if someone does contract the coronavirus. And then also looking at substance use and basic needs. That some other risk factors for people living with substance use disorders include decreased access to health care, and that limited access to health care places people with substance use disorders at greater risk for many illnesses. And on top of that, if hospitals and clinics are pushed to their capacity with the current pandemic, it could be that people who have other kinds of illnesses and illnesses related to a substance use history, who are already stigmatized and underserved by the healthcare system, will experience even greater barriers in order to get any kind of treatment for any kind of health concern, including treatment for COVID-19. And so, so often in speaking with people who are in long-term recovery, as well as people who are still in more chaotic kind of substance use, and continuing to use in ways that are counter to their own recovery goals. Time and time again, I hear so many stories about the stigma at the hands of the healthcare system and really misdiagnosis and being underserved and having really limited access to healthcare for a whole host of reasons. And then on top of that, with the increased health vulnerability and with a healthcare system that if it does in fact become overwhelmed with a pandemic, then people living with substance use disorder are at even greater risk for not being able to access affirming and adequate health care. And then also looking at housing stability, that housing is the foundation of health, and that people living with substance use disorders have decreased access to housing stability and are at higher risk of homelessness and unstable or unsafe housing. And housing instability within this pandemic can expose people to environments where they're in close contact with others who might also be at higher risk for infections. So just the same way that people living with substance use disorder are at higher risk for highly communicable diseases such as tuberculosis, we see the same kinds of dynamics increasing risks related to COVID-19. And then specifically looking at incarceration, that while substance use is criminalized and while there are criminal legal approaches to a health condition, we know that people living with substance use disorders are at increased risk for legal system involvement and incarceration. We also know that incarceration is not neutral, that people of color are overrepresented in the legal system, and that 4 out of 5 arrests are people of color for simple possession, are people of color, despite there being no evidence of differences in rates of substance use or substance use disorder. And in a current pandemic, incarceration can expose people to environments where they're in close contact with others who might also be at higher risk for infection. The prospect of self-quarantine and other public health measures can disrupt access to all kinds of services that help somebody remain safe and help support somebody's recovery. And then if somebody experiences a return to use or is using in ways that are more chaotic, and how that can increase risk for legal system involvement and incarceration. Additionally, we also know that that the need to quarantine, to shelter in place, to self-quarantine if somebody is sick or has been exposed, can really interrupt access to all kinds of services, including syringe services, accessing medication-assisted treatment, and other kinds of support needed by people, and particularly people with an opioid use disorder, who really things like syringe service programs and medication-assisted treatment programs are in fact life-saving. And so again, want to hear from all of you as we think about recovery capital. So all of the internal and external resources and supports that a person accesses that aids in their journey of recovery. How does the current pandemic threaten our recovery capital? So some of the things that come up, of course, threatening our physical health, threatening our safe shelter, especially for people who may be sheltering in place with someone who is abusive, threatening our basic needs and financial resources, the vast amount of job loss of people who access food safety net programs, of people who qualify for school-based nutritional programs, the lack of access to community, school closures limiting interaction, the lack of access to peer-led support groups, especially with anybody who may not have access to technology, to broadband internet, to different technological devices to be able to access digital-based support groups. People who are sheltering in place with someone who is abusive may not be able to access either a treatment provider or a 12-step meeting or smart recovery meeting through the technology. They may be cut off and isolated in that way, as that is a form of abuse. People being cut off from family or being very concerned about family, especially elders who may be in high-risk living situations, or they may not be able to visit and care for because of the risk of the higher risk of COVID-19 to our elders and potentially passing along a virus unknowingly. And the additional pressure of being a sole provider if a partner has lost their job, absolutely. Or being able to access health insurance. That health insurance, with any kinds of either underemployment or unemployment often comes along also being cut off from our health insurance resources. And that also looking at the human quadrant of recovery capital, that our hopefulness can feel really threatened and under pressure. Our sense of self-efficacy, that we can set a goal and work toward that goal, can really be threatened. That within the chaos, we can feel really powerless, and powerless in a way that really detracts from our recovery capital. Absolutely. Parents having the added pressure of becoming teachers, right? Teachers and social directors and needing to care for children who are also having their own reactions and going through all the same things and fears and absorbing the fears of all the adults around them as well. Absolutely. Being pulled in so many different directions. And it can really call into question our sense of core values and personal values. I remember speaking with someone who had recently been laid off after actually having taken a new job. So had been working somewhere for a long time, had taken a new job, and then had been laid off. And how a real core value of theirs was having a really strong work ethic, and that a lot of their personal identity was intertwined with their professional identity, which is true for many people, and that experiencing that job loss really called into question, kind of really shook them into their core values, and how that our core values play a really large role in our recovery. And coping with all the issues that really put pressure on and tax our mental health, and that it's really hard to deal with all the complexity of all the different stressors, and how that has a really negative impact on our recovery capital, or can have a really negative impact. And then thank you so much for raising this. Someone put in the chat that there are also these unrealistic expectations to improve ourselves during the time at home, that there's been some kind of narratives around, well, this is the time to, write that novel, or you're going to really, exercise a lot and get in shape, or you're going to come out of this like brand new, amazing, person. And that while there can be a lot of benefit to trying to reframe one situation around, okay, what can I do with my new normal? How can I adapt within this? That by that same token, there's this unrealistic pressure and expectation to improve ourselves, as if we're not going through this kind of massive historical trauma that is threatening our well-being and the well-being of our loved ones and of our communities in all of these different, multifaceted, complex ways. And so people are then finding themselves feeling really alienated and really guilty about, what they're, quote, supposed to be doing with their time during this time. And that can be another piece that really, that guilt or that sense of shame can really drive either that chaotic substance use or that return to substance use. And then this is a really interesting comment here in the chat. Should we add technology to recovery capital? We're seeing now what a basic need technology has become in our society. This is no longer something that we can kind of take or leave. This is not a luxury at this point. That technology is really something that is part of our kind of core functioning as a society and as a community, and for individuals and families. And so that seems like absolutely would actually fall in potentially several of these quadrants during the pandemic, both in being able to attend to the physical quadrant of our just financial resources and basic needs, and even physical health, as so many healthcare appointments are becoming telehealth, but then also the social quadrants, being able to connect with our social supports, and then in our community, being able to connect with recovery role models, with anti-stigma community and peer-led support groups, and as well as the human piece. As was mentioned in my introduction, I also teach at the University of Chicago, and teaching a whole quarter online now, and all of these kind of the skill building, the education that is happening outside the home, right? Because there's also life skills happening within the home, but everything that's happening outside the home is based in technology. And so one of the things that a lot of educators have been talking about is, what are we grading people on, and how is our grading reflecting how much access someone has to technology versus their actual applying of themselves and being able to grasp and develop different competencies and skills. And then, yes, absolutely, taxing on family relationships as everyone is stressed, working and living together. Absolutely. Very early on in the pandemic, it was interesting to see that many therapists were reporting that their individual therapy clients were saying, like, okay, let's just take a week or two off and see if this pandemic resolves, but that the couples therapists were actually seeing increases in their caseloads. I think that that's now evened out now that we see that the pandemic is not just here for a week or two, but absolutely family relationships, there being really new forms of stress. And then in the context of there being any kind of abuse within the family that is sheltering in place, then all of those normal sources of, those usual sources of kind of safety and support, whether it's school or work or being able to drop into an office or an abusive partner being away at work and just being able to have some respite and being able to get some support, we're seeing that that has also not accessible for people who are experiencing abuse within their family or within their household. And a lot of fear, absolutely. Fear for one's health, fear for one's family, fear for economic safety, fear of losing one's job or having already lost one's job, fear of bringing home the virus for those who are essential workers and are not able to work from home, or are needing to continue to go in, for example, to methadone to be able to pick up their take-home supply or be able to go in for their medication on a daily or every few days basis, and the fear of of contracting a virus or bringing that virus home to one's family and loved ones. Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone. And then, as mentioned before, the complexity of how this pandemic interrupts our access to our usual recovery resources, including our resources for overdose prevention services and our recovery support. Absolutely. So, dropping anchor, what we can do to help support continuing recovery during COVID-19. So I invite everyone to put in the chat, what have you found helpful for supporting continuing recovery during this pandemic? And as I see what you put in the chat, I'll call it out loud as I move forward. So in this section, some things we'll go through. Cognitive behavioral approaches to relapse prevention, coping skills, continuity of care, and then digital tools and resources. And I'm seeing here in the chat, people limiting the amount of news watched. Absolutely. That while it's important to know what's going on and to get our information from trustworthy sources, we also don't want to get caught up in like a 24-hour kind of just getting sucked into constantly, reading everything. That can be really taxing on our well-being. Reaching out to others through social media and other ways. Being able to talk about it. Absolutely. Being able to talk about the reality of what's going on, as well as being able to connect with people and talk about things that are non-pandemic related. And sometimes people can feel guilty, like, is it okay that I'm actually just, having fun or just laughing with my loved one? Is that okay right now? People are feeling a lot of survivor's guilt, even when they are able to access those little shining moments of joy in their lives. And so being able to talk about it, as well as being able to talk about things that are not pandemic related. Absolutely. So here, a refresher on the cognitive behavioral model of lapse and relapse. So here, it's not about kind of having the willpower. It's not about not being strong enough or any of those kinds of things, that there's actually a very kind of predictable way that lapse, that return to use or return to chaotic use, that lapse and relapse occur. And so there's a high-risk situation, and we could either have an effective coping response or our coping can be overwhelmed. We can have an ineffective coping response. If we have an effective coping response, then we will be able to cope with that high-risk situation. Then we will have a sense of increased self-efficacy, which we saw earlier as part of that recovery capital, which then contributes to a decreased probability of relapse. On the other hand, if our coping response and coping tools are overwhelmed in that moment, and then we have a sense of decreased self-efficacy, that we have kind of a disempowering experience. And if that becomes paired with a positive expectation of the substance, so that becomes paired with, this substance is going to lead to something good, at least in the short term. And typically it's more so the initial effects of the substances that we're talking about here, not the long-term effects. And that then paired together leads to that initial return to substance or return to a chaotic substance use. From there, the abstinence violation effect presents kind of a key turning point for that initial return to use or that initial chaotic use. And when I say chaotic use, I mean use in a way that is not aligned with our recovery goals. That then, due to the abstinence violation effect, we then see an increased probability of a more full return to the substance use disorder or a more full return to chaotic substance use. And we'll go through in detail a little more about each of these pieces, as well as what contributes to them and what we as treatment providers, as recovery support specialists, and as other allied professionals can do to support folks in really dropping anchor and really grounding ourselves in the stability of recovery and long-term recovery. So first, looking at some common factors in lapse that decrease self-efficacy, distressful internal states, isolation, a lack of social support, interpersonal conflict, traumatic distress, moments for recreation or celebration, or moments for self-reward. That we know that in recovery we have to learn not only how to deal with the hardship, we also know that we have to learn how to celebrate again many times. Exposure to alcohol or to other drug use situations, and more, including things like domestic violence and substance use coercion, the pattern of domestic violence that is specific to substance use. And so here, looking at this list, I imagine that there's a lot of ahas going on, because as we look at this list, we basically have a menu of what many people are experiencing within this current pandemic, right? So this is something that that is really coming up even more so for so many of us. And that, of course, it's important to individualize our continuing recovery planning so that people have the opportunity and support to uncover what some of their personal cues for use are and or risky situations are. That always we want to really be able to individualize this. So how that initial use becomes a more kind of full return to a substance use disorder. The abstinence violation effect. So here are some pieces that strengthen, that make it more likely for the abstinence violation effect to happen. First, all or nothing thinking. So kind of all is lost if that like if I mess up and use a little bit or use in a way that was counter to my recovery goals, then, I already messed up. It's already all lost, right? Or that all or nothing thinking can also show up as, I'm just done using, I'm just never going to use again, and that's it. And that becomes a form of barrier to really expanding one's coping toolbox, one's different kind of skills and continuing recovery planning. As well as when a person believes that the factors contributing to the relapse are beyond their control, right? So that there's this kind of sense of powerlessness, and there's kind of nothing I can do about it. Now, this is not the kind of powerlessness that's talked about in 12-step programming, but can certainly, people who aren't engaged with some kind of sponsorship and fellowship might confuse that sense of powerlessness for this. And so that's where it's not enough just to, read steps within 12-step. That's why there's step work, not just reading steps, but step work, and working with a sponsor and connecting with fellowship and, of course, with service. So we just wanted to point out that there can be some confusion, conflating powerlessness with 12-step with feeling like factors contributing to relapse are beyond one's control, and that's not actually what 12-step is saying at all. That there is a self-attribution effect. So a person really blames the cause of their relapse to internal weakness and personal failure. That then people get into a self-blame, guilt, and shame spiral, which then really drives the substance use and a chaotic substance use. And then also negative affect, so, depressed mood, and a low sense of self-efficacy, so really feeling kind of hopeless, or like it doesn't really matter what you do, you're just going to you're going to fail no matter what. These also strengthen the abstinence violation effect. So what can we do? Preventing a lapse from becoming a relapse. So first of all, providing psychoeducation about how lapse and relapse happen, as well as having an emergency plan for if lapse occurs, that all of this helps a lapse from becoming a relapse. And so even something as simple as a psychoeducation, that a lapse doesn't have to progress to a relapse. And that often it's our own reactions, our emotional reactions, and to the lapse that then leads to the relapse. And so really helping people, that psychoeducation helps build their self-efficacy. And that it's not self-efficacy based on shame or guilt or moralizing, but it's more like, hey, there's something predictable about this. We can learn about this, and we can, what we do can actually change the course of what happens here. And that part of that is learning about these seemingly irrelevant decisions, that there are a series of many decisions that begin a chain of behaviors that set the stage for a lapse. And many of us have often heard the kind of slogan or kind of I would say, practical wisdom, practice wisdom, that people relapse way before they ever pick up again, right? So that's really talking about that there are a set of factors and many decisions, so many that we might not even notice them, that kind of set the stage for that high-risk situation. And so what we can do here is that we want to explore and uncover these seemingly irrelevant thoughts, behaviors, and decisions that can lead to these high-risk situations. So we can help encourage reflection and a thoughtful approach to these decisions, no matter how small they may seem. We can explore apparent rationalizations and the overlooking of potentially risky decisions. And then from there, we can make a plan for how to mitigate those risks and for how to mitigate those potential lapses so they don't become relapses. Now, this really requires us to have the ability to build trustworthy relationships that are based in compassion, empathy, and respect. Because if, as people explore these many decisions, they can have a lot of aha moments, but those aha moments can also come along with some experiences of shame. Like, oh my gosh, how could I not have seen that? That was so clear, it's so obvious, right? And that as people feel that for themselves, that's part of them uncovering these seemingly irrelevant decisions in order to prevent lapse or prevent a lapse from becoming a relapse. But that if there's any sense of kind of shame or I told you so or judgment in our relationship, in our helping relationships, then people are going to naturally, we're going to put them in a defensive stance where they're either not going to really have the space they need to reflect on these seemingly irrelevant decisions, or if and when they do, they're going to get really stuck in that sense of shame rather than being able to really process that shame in order to make a plan that supports their continuing recovery. And so, for folks who feel like, oh, well, people who use substances always rationalize or have excuses, this is a really important point to reflect on those attitudes and really look at how are those attitudes serving long-term recovery of the people in your care, and how are they shutting down conversation and new insights? Because the evidence is clear that shame and guilt and judgment do not produce long-term recovery. What they do contribute to is more chaotic use. So assessing high-risk situations, a return to substance use tends to not be random. There tends to be some pretty predictable pieces that come into place. And so this is where behavior chaining is an especially relevant skill set for assessing previous returns to substance use. And I highly encourage everybody to, whenever possible, to write down your behavior chains as you're going through them. That as somebody is able to see, have a visual of the behavior chain, they're able to draw conclusions and see patterns that they aren't always able to see or draw from when they're just talking about it. Now, in our kind of telehealth-based reality right now, for folks who are able to provide telehealth-based services and are providing kind of distance-based services, this requires us to learn potentially some new skills and get a little savvy. So, for example, this may mean learning how to, have a video conference meeting, but also either in the chat, or sometimes we can do like a share screen and use a Word document or a notepad to type out some of the behavior chain pieces so that we can both see it together. Now, if somebody doesn't have access to video-based conferencing, either because they don't have access to the technology or it wouldn't be safe because they're sheltering in place with someone who is not supportive or is a risk to their recovery or is abusive, and they're only able to access a phone-based counseling service, then we won't be able to provide a visual. But that's okay. Behavior chaining can still, we're doing the best we can within our circumstances. So just like always, we're doing the best we can with what we have, where we are, and that this is true of our profession with and without a pandemic, right? And so it's part of our own creativity and ingenuity of doing what we can, where we are, with what we have. But here are some pieces that we want to assess. When is the substance use occurring? So looking at the most recent return to use or chaotic use, when it's occurring, where it's occurring, where people got the substances, where they were used, where they recovered from the substance use, who they got substances from, who they used substances with, who they recovered with, what were some of those external reminders and cues as well as internal emotional states, both before the use as well as during the use, and what did they anticipate getting out of the use? What was the anticipated benefit? Remember in that cognitive behavioral model of lapse and relapse, talking about how it's that decreased self-efficacy paired with the positive outcome expectancy. So a really important part is understanding what do people hope to or expect to get out of the use in that moment? What's the function of the use? What do they think the use would help them with? And then also finding out what was the effect of the substance. So both what was the anticipated kind of benefit or, what would come out of the use and then what actually happened with the use. And in my experience, those tend to be different. And then also being able to manage lapses. Really important here, and we'll spend the second half of our time together on this, is overdose prevention, education, and planning. To be able to counteract the abstinence violation effect through psychoeducation and planning ahead. So talking through what would the person find helpful if they experience a lapse, and how could we, as the helping professional, be supportive in that situation? Asking about the circumstances surrounding prior lapses and incorporating this information into their treatment planning, their recovery support planning, and their continuing recovery planning. And that here, we really want to also focus on expanding their coping skills. As we saw in that cognitive behavioral model of lapse and relapse, how those first funnels, really that fork in the road is that effective coping response versus having the coping response being overwhelmed. And something that can be helpful here is teaching value-based avoidance. Now, value-based avoidance helps us cope with the piece around what may be high-risk situations that we need to distance ourselves from. And that this can become really helpful for folks because many times people find themselves in high-risk situations because there's something about that situation that was personally important or meaningful to them. And so when we can teach value-based avoidance, we can teach a way of really analyzing a situation and then deciding whether or not to avoid it or to engage the situation. So walking through it. If the situation is of high value to us, so it's personally meaningful to us, and it poses a low risk to our recovery, then we want to go for it. This is what we really want to invite into our life and build into our daily experience, our daily lives. Now, if something holds very low value to us, really doesn't matter to us, we can take it or leave it, really isn't personally meaningful to us, and is a high risk to our recovery, then that's something that we want to put in the avoid long-term bucket. And something that's really important is that as we go through and identify these situations in our lives, then it becomes that much easier to recognize these situations and then be able to recognize them from a ways off and avoid them from a ways off. And to be really clear on why we're avoiding them, because they are not important, they are not meaningful, but they are very risky, they are very dangerous for us. Now, where things can get a little more difficult to sort through and can be really helpful to sort through with a recovery support specialist, a treatment provider, a sponsor, or someone else who is a recovery support is when something poses a high risk to our recovery, but is also high value. It's very meaningful to us. And here, what we want to do is avoid short term while we build up our recovery coping skills and build up our recovery social support. So things that kind of fall in this category are, for example, like family weddings, or family celebrations. And so these can also then provide the motivation to really develop and expand that coping skill set as we see, I don't have to avoid this thing forever, this thing that's really meaningful to me. I don't have to say I will never, ever, ever, be in this situation again. And instead we frame it as what I need to do is work on developing all of my recovery capital and getting some recovery time under the belt in order to be able to return to this situation that holds a very deep significance and meaning for me. And then responding to a lapse. So in responding to a lapse, it's really important for us to remain neutral. That us remaining neutral really allows people the space they need to express themselves and have their own reaction with us. And that this includes verbal and nonverbal. So some of us may need to practice our faces in the mirror, right? Or we may not know. I know I've been told at times that I have a poker face. I remember someone said that they felt like they could say anything to me and I wouldn't have like this big negative reaction or have some kind of judgmental look on my face. I've also had times where people have told me that I was so transparent and they could, read exactly what I was thinking on my face. And so this is something that that feedback is helpful on and that we can also may need to practice, especially for those of us who may be more expressive. Expressing gratitude for open communication and affirming people's commitment to recovery. That if people are sharing this with us, it's because they want our help with it. That there's even just a piece of them who's saying this person that has hope, and this person is someone who could help me with this, and I want that help, right? Attending to any negative emotions to be able to minimize shame, to neutralize shame, so that we can really frame this as an opportunity to learn more about ourselves, to learn about our recovery needs, and to really strengthen our recovery plan. From there, with permission, exploring circumstances that led to the lapse. So being able to say, would it be all right if I asked you some questions about what happened, right? And then from there, just naturally flowing into behavior chaining, incorporating insights from the behavior chaining into the continuing recovery plan and or treatment plan, and then finalizing with consolidating that commitment to their recovery. And this is where motivational interviewing skills can be really helpful in helping to strengthen and elicit and consolidate people's commitment to their recovery. And another skill here is reframing the lapse, that learning not to view a lapse as a failure or a lack of willpower. That comes from a moral model of substance use disorders, not any, kind of a health-based model. That we know that lapses are part of a predictable and potentially controllable event, not due to personal failures or character flaws, and that we can engage folks in education about the relapse process, and that we can help them to navigate the relapse process through ongoing efforts to sustain change. And so here, I've talked a lot about expanding coping skills. So I want to offer some coping skills that can be particularly important in supporting ongoing recovery. So in supporting skill development, understanding that this is the how of change, and that the how of change is meaningless without the why of change, the intrinsic motivation. So we want to be sure that we're not only focusing on the how of change, because I often think about, when we teach something like drug refusal skills, that people typically actually know how to say no to someone offering them drugs if they want to say no to offering them to no to the offer of drugs. But if they're really feeling an intense craving experience in that moment, and they're feeling a craving or a desire for the drug, and they're not sure, how to navigate that it's not just about saying no to the drug that's being offered. It's about being really rooted in the why, right? Why their recovery is important to them, what their recovery, how that connects to their life goals and to their core values. And that's where motivational interviewing can become very important, as well as value-based approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy. Now, that said, we are going to talk here about more of the skill pieces, the how of change. So first, the really kind of classic 5 Ds: deep breathing, drinking water, delaying, knowing that the urge or the craving will pass, doing something else to help take our mind off the urge, that usually the cravings kind of change as we put ourselves in different situations and we get busy, and discussing with a safe social support. And so these are some of the kind of classic ways to respond to craving experiences and to manage them. Now, mindfulness is also an important skill that we can teach. So the ability to identify and diffuse the craving experience, both the physiological and the psychological craving experience. And that here, it's really important to provide that psychoeducation that cravings tend to peak and then will naturally fall within 5 to 10 minutes. Cravings will subside regardless of the use, and the use reinforces the craving. And so one way to talk about this is actually like waves, that cravings rise and fall like waves. Sometimes they're little waves, sometimes they're big waves. Sometimes the waves come quickly, sometimes they come more slowly. Now, the more that we use in response to a craving, the bigger and more the quicker the cravings are, the more often and frequent they come. But that the more that we're able to cope with the craving and not use, the cravings will over time become less frequent and become less strong. And so with urge surfing, this comes from relapse prevention therapy, and there are 3 basic steps. First is mindfulness, which then helps us to direct our focus to where we are feeling the craving sensation, and then being able to describe the sensation to ourselves, shifting to different areas of our body as we experience that craving, and then from there, being able to ride out the craving, to know that that craving will rise and fall, and that we don't have to do anything about it. It will naturally go away again. And this is a time where we can just observe it, or we can just watch it and practice mindfulness while observing it until it falls again. And so something here I often think about is helping people to become a reliable container of their human experience. That they don't have to run away from the craving. They don't have to do anything to, drastic to get rid of the craving. That they can just be with that craving and watch it, and the craving will naturally rise and fall. This can also be used for any negative internal state that may lead to substance use or chaotic use. So if something that tends to be involved in my return to chaotic use is intense loneliness or intense sadness, I can also use this kind of surfing mindfulness approach to just observe that internal state, to observe that feeling and emotion, to be with it, to not have to change it, because naturally it will dissipate. But things tend to stick around and become stronger when we try to really push it away versus when we just notice it, when we name it and claim it. And then craving management planning, helping people develop a list for managing craving and really partnering with them to make a list of those soothing behaviors, and that the list needs to feel realistic and helpful in different situations. They need to have it in an accessible place, and that we can role play consulting a list, selecting from the list, and then practicing it. Sometimes people can feel kind of silly role playing it in session with us, but here's the thing. If they feel silly role playing it with us in session, we need to work through that, because they're probably also going to feel silly pulling it out and consulting it when they're actually experiencing a craving if that's not something that they've practiced. And that this is something that we want to check in with people over time and help them reevaluate and revise it regularly. That there are things that we may think will be soothing for us that when we actually try it, turns out aren't really helpful. And so this is something that we don't just do once and forget about, but that we want to be regularly checking in with people around, have they used it lately? What was it like? What was the situation that they used it in? Affirming them for using it, and then what were some of the things that they found helpful, and what were some of the things that either weren't so accessible for them or didn't feel as effective for them, as well as what have they learned lately that they could add to it. And then now talking about continuity of care as well as digital tools and resources. So ensuring that continuity of care, that in this pandemic, we need to remain open and available, even if that means remaining open and available in untraditional ways, such as through telehealth. The CDC offers information on sanitary practices for essential service providers that must remain open and must continue to provide site-based services. We also want to continue new treatment admissions whenever there is capacity in our services, and we want to find ways to expand the capacity because we know that there's escalating need in the current pandemic. We want to have frequent and accessible communication and assertive engagement, telephonic outreach and follow-up, and that, if we haven't heard from someone, that we're not just waiting for them to reach out to us, but that we're assertively engaging them. And that we also want to collaborate with other providers, including housing, mental health, domestic violence, child and family advocates, food pantries, schools, etc. And we want to make it easy as possible for people to access us. I was talking with a provider. They were launching Zoom meetings, and someone had said, like, oh, well, how about we have like a different Zoom meeting, number each time? No, that is not easy to access. We're all juggling so much. I myself am getting so confused with what's the login for this and what's the login for that. We need to have consistency and ease of access at every imaginable point. We want to make it really, really easy because we are all stressed and overwhelmed, and so accessing our services needs to be like a real no-brainer. It needs to be really, really easy. Ensuring medication access, supporting continuity of care and uninterrupted access to medications for mental health and or substance use recovery. And then here's some information that is evolving every day around methadone and buprenorphine. But methadone, states can apply for blanket exceptions to allow 28-day take-home for clients who are considered stable and 14-day take-homes for clients who do not meet the stable criteria. And when people don't meet the stable criteria, we need to be really clear about what is still needed and offer supports and resources and services to help people meet that criteria. And that we also need to plan for curbside pickup and or home delivery for people who must self-quarantine. SAMHSA has published several guidance documents specific for opioid treatment programs, as well as ambulatory withdrawal management for alcohol and benzodiazepines. The DEA has also published telehealth guidelines for controlled substances, including that buprenorphine can now be prescribed through telephone-based evaluation to both new and existing clients. Additionally, supporting access to psychotropic medications and support for co-occurring disorders is even more important during this time marked by increased stress and isolation. And so here, we also want to increase contact and ways to connect. So in creative use of texting, building in more opportunities for checking in and for peer support, helping address the digital divide, helping link people with resources so that they can have stable phone access as well as internet access whenever possible. This may include spending more time walking people through how to navigate technology that is newer to them. There are some treatment-compatible smart apps that can be used in combination with programming as a way to enhance virtual contact and connection. And so here are some different resources to support behavioral health during the pandemic. So first, resources from the Addiction Technology Transfer Centers. They have a resource directory of things that they have developed that has a wealth of resources, including a guide to using text messages, telephone and online support groups, mobile apps as clinician extenders, and best practices in telemental health. Also, please be sure to check out the COVID-19 resource list and all the resources offered by FADA. And then connecting with community recovery support. Here are some different resources. There are many others, but really looking at online meetings and chats, phone-based, both voice and text, social media, as well as connecting with informational materials like readings, podcasts, and videos. In the Rooms is a free online recovery tool that offers 130 weekly online meetings and embraces multiple pathways to recovery. Soberistas provides a women-only international online recovery community. The Tribe offers peer-to-peer support groups for individuals as well as their loved ones. And this SAMHSA resource is a pretty comprehensive list of virtual community recovery resources for both substance use and mental health. There are also recovery applications, free recovery applications for people who have access to smartphones and find it helpful to interact with smartphone applications. Here are some free options. There's the COVID Coach, which is developed by the PTSD Center from the Veterans Administration. And it's really interactive and highly customizable and includes different challenges. So it kind of challenges you to build different coping skills, which some people find it really helpful to kind of gamify their learning. And there's actually a lot of interesting research coming out around gamifying education and skill building. And then there's also a lot of other kind of built-in pieces to this, like you can build in your own playlist of soothing songs or songs that help you deal with cravings or really whatever kind of playlist, whatever experience you would want to program a playlist for. And then if you're having that experience, you can just pull it up and start it going. And some people have found it helpful to develop a playlist to help manage panic attacks, for example. And the VA also has a lot of other free smartphone applications, including mood trackers, mindfulness, a parenting application, as well as applications that are companions to evidence-based treatment. There's also Sober Tool, which helps people identify different thought patterns that are more likely to lead to relapse, and then help them reframe their thoughts. So a very kind of cognitive-based tool. There's In the Rooms, which is just the app version of the website that was mentioned on the previous slide. Sober Grid is the largest mobile sober community and is free, personalized resource for tracking and sharing your recovery progress with others, as well as giving and receiving support. They also offer a 24/7 live peer coaching resource that has a free trial offer, and then people, if they wanted to, could opt in to pay for it moving forward. Our Tribe is an application that allows you to create an anonymous profile and then connect with others through individual and group messaging, track your recovery, share your progress, and reach out when you're feeling cravings or other challenging situations. And for many people, the anonymous piece is still going to be very important for a lot of different reasons. Smiling Mind is a mindfulness app that is family friendly. And so people can actually find it really helpful to kind of share with their whole family. And I've also heard from people who tend towards more, either are beginners in mindfulness or tend towards more kind of, and tend to experience more anxiety, how they find that a family-friendly mindfulness application is more kind of soothing and accessible because it tends to be a little simpler and a little just kind of user-friendly. And then Liberate, which is kind of my personal favorite mindfulness app. It's created by and for people of color, and there is a free version as well as a paid subscribe version because they're trying to build in a sustainability model for it, but there is still a free version that people can access. And it has really, really very, very lovely culturally specific mindfulness practices that include things like connecting with the earth and healing ancestors and, overcoming just different kinds of experiences that are culturally specific, as well as tapping into culturally specific resilience and resources. So here, we'll go ahead and take our 5-minute pause.
Thank you. If everyone can be back at 12:22, that would be great. Thank you. Gabriella?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, I'm sorry. I just saw your message.
That's totally fine.
Hello?
Yeah, we do have a question on the board. I guess if you want to give everybody a couple minutes to get back.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and, we said we'd take the 5 minutes, so we can go ahead and take those.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Uh-huh. Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone back. And I guess we'll get started with answering a question or two. Gabriella, we did have a question on the board. Can you talk a bit about recognizing risk behaviors indicative of relapse through a virtual meeting? The interaction is so different. There is a concern that we may be missing something.
Sure. So I would start with thinking about what you might notice if you were in person, and start by, what if that translates to the virtual context. So I know some things that that I would often notice kind of early on preceding a relapse would be people voicing, kind of positive expectations of substance use. People voicing, how, it was almost like people like wondering out loud around positive expectations of substance use. So kind of listening for any of those positive expectations around use. And it's not something to kind of get, worried about, but it's something to notice so that we can respond to and help people kind of think through. And it becomes really important to talk about these things, because whatever we don't talk about does come out in our behavior, right? People potentially like mourning things that they've lost with positive changes in their recovery, which is a very natural part of recovery. And so I wouldn't take that as necessarily a sign for potential lapse, but it is important for us to be able to be responsive to that and validating, while also helping people build plans for how they can access some of those things in the life that they're building in recovery, because otherwise people can end up feeling like that becomes another reason to return to use. So there's a lot of kind of verbal behavior that can come up still in a virtual setting. Otherwise, you might notice some like changes, like someone who's normally talkative isn't talkative at all. Someone who normally doesn't talk at all is now like talking to the whole group, right? We always want to pay attention to when there are drastic changes from someone's baseline, because that can mean a lot of different things. And what it means most of all is that it's important for us to really tune into them and check in with them and get a sense of how they're doing and what's going on for them, and how we can offer support. The more kind of physical things we might notice about somebody when they already have experienced a lapse, some different physical signs, or maybe we, sometimes even smell something different. We might not have as much access to those physical pieces. That said, I've also heard some reports of people feeling somewhat more comfortable to self-disclose over a virtual setting, because they feel kind of less stigma than when they're in person. So it's something else to consider potentially is, what can we do to really create a situation, an environment, a relational environment where people feel that much more comfortable really telling us what's coming up for them, so that we don't need to be, trying to necessarily uncover it ourselves. And in the same way that just because it is different, it's not the same as being in person with someone. Absolutely. So then moving into overdose prevention. And so seeing that all signs point to there being increased risk for overdose in the current pandemic, and that we were already in the grips of an overdose epidemic before this started. So you see here the ever-escalating trend of accidental overdose deaths. And that in 2018, we don't have the 2019 numbers yet, but that in 2018 there was a small dip in overdose fatalities, and so that gives us hope that the things that we've been putting in place including overdose prevention and naloxone distribution, are working, and that we need to make them much more accessible. And if we aren't already providing overdose education and naloxone distribution, it's something that is really important for us to start providing. And that here, just showing that that the overdose epidemic is largely driven by the presence of fentanyl. That we see here, the synthetic opioids are really driving the overdose epidemic. And so many places are actually starting to refer to this more as a drug poisoning crisis, because the rates of use haven't necessarily changed that drastically. It's more so the drug supply has been poisoned in many communities by the presence of fentanyl. Something else to note here is that accidental overdose is the leading cause of death for people under age 50, and the leading cause of accidental death, that more people die from overdose than any other accidental death. And then looking at a comparison of overdose deaths in Florida, that we see here that fentanyl is largely the driver, specifically in Florida. And that we see that, but we see also that fatalities that involve the presence of cocaine have also been increasing in recent years. So here, looking specifically at the presence of fentanyl in fatalities and how that has been increasing. And here we see this number in the thousands. And that when it comes to cocaine, this has been increasing with a slight dip, again here in the thousands. And then with methamphetamine, that this also is on a trend of increasing in Florida. But here, roughly about half of the people impacted compared to cocaine and fentanyl. But still, absolutely a trend of increasing. So it's not just opioid-related overdose that we need to be aware of and ready to provide education and prevention planning around, but also stimulant-related overdose. So evidence-supported opioid overdose prevention. There are three things that have strong evidence, three practices that have strong evidence around curbing community-level fatal overdoses. And we have access to two of them in the state. Medication-assisted treatment, specifically methadone and buprenorphine, naloxone distribution, and overdose prevention centers. There's also growing evidence for fentanyl testing, which we'll talk more about later, and real-time drug checking. Real-time drug checking, so fentanyl testing will tell you whether there's fentanyl present in the substance, and we'll talk more about why that's important and how that can help prevent fatal overdose. And then real-time drug checking, which is very, very limited right now. There's just a CDC-funded study that has a handful of locations. And that tells you the full composition of what's in the substance. And the reason why that is important and is being studied right now is because in some communities, the drug supply all has fentanyl in it. And so knowing that it has fentanyl in it doesn't really tell you, fentanyl testing doesn't really tell you much because it's all has some fentanyl in it. So real-time drug checking can let you know exactly what the percentages are of the different substances present so that then people can know what it is that they have in their possession, and then they can use harm reduction efforts to prevent fatal overdose. Now, this is, talking with one real-time drug checking location, I came to learn that some of the drugs that they had tested that people had purchased, what they thought was Xanax on the street, and it ended up being just pure fentanyl that had been pressed to look like Xanax. Now, that is a huge overdose risk if somebody who, has no idea that what they have in their hands is fentanyl, which is such strong opioid, and what they think that they have is Xanax, which will have a completely different kind of risk profile. And also that they have found that things that have been sold as MDMA also have had have been mixtures of fentanyl and other drugs. So this is where real-time drug checking is becoming a kind of cutting-edge overdose prevention intervention. So what can we do in this overdose epidemic that predates the pandemic and is exacerbated by the pandemic? We can help by first encouraging open and person-centered conversations about alcohol and other substance use. And that trustworthy relationships are key here, that people will only trust the information that we are providing around overdose prevention if they trust us. That we can help people learn about risk factors for overdose, learn what an overdose looks like and what to do if someone may be overdosing, providing overdose prevention education, engaging people in overdose prevention planning, and then helping people to access naloxone easily, often, frequently, hopefully by us distributing the naloxone to them directly so that there's no gap in them being able to access naloxone. So all the time, if people just walked into our setting when I was a formal treatment provider and we didn't have time to do an intake or information session with them, we would still make sure that we covered overdose prevention and helped and distributed naloxone to them on the spot. And we always ask, how many kits do you need? You know, who else do you know who may need naloxone? Because we really want to saturate the community with naloxone, and that has been found to curb fatal overdoses and does not increase rates of use. So first, learning overdose risk factors. And I'm going to invite everyone to write in the chat how the current pandemic increases overdose risk. And I'm going to keep moving just because I am running, as per usual, a little bit behind schedule. And I'll do my best to kind of mention things that come up in the chat as we go forward. So first, there are certain social conditions and factors that increase people's risk for overdose. People experiencing housing instability, overdose has been found to be a leading cause of death. Same holds true for people experiencing incarceration. People in treatment for opioid use disorder. Now, this evidence that detox was found to pose a higher risk for overdose than no treatment at all. And this is specifically detoxing and not having stabilization on any kind of, opioid maintenance medication leaves a person without any tolerance to opioids but still experiencing cravings to use, which is then a high risk for both returning to use and then experiencing an accidental fatal overdose due to the loss of tolerance. And so this raises a real ethical question around detoxing without stabilizing and kind of that continuous stabilization on a medication, an opioid maintenance medication. And then people living with HIV, that an individual living with HIV may be at higher risk for overdose for a few different reasons. One is that their overall health and ability to process substances may be compromised. Another reason may be due to the medications they're prescribed, that some HIV medications can boost the effects of other substances. And then what about domestic violence and sexual assault? So preliminary findings from an ongoing study being led by Louisa Gilbert, PhD from Columbia University, faculty at Columbia University, has found that experiencing domestic violence and/or sexual assault increases risk of overdose. So some of her preliminary findings are that women who experience DVSA, particularly physical and/or sexual violence, were 61% more likely to overdose, and that only 6% of women who use drugs and identify needing DV services were able to access DV services. So there are many factors that contribute to this increased risk, including substance use coercion, as well as siloed systems and providers and services who, on both ends of the spectrum, either don't know how to respond to the DVSA or don't know how to respond to the substance use, so the siloing of services. And that survivors get really caught between systems then and have all kinds of increased risk. And then some additional overdose risk factors. Now, so using alone, quite simply, there's no one there to notice the overdose and offer help. The overdose, you can't reverse your own overdose. And so using alone and thinking about how that is coming up in the pandemic for folks, right? A history of prior overdoses. I think about this as kind of like once your body learns how to overdose, your susceptibility to overdose is that much higher, becomes that much easier to overdose. An erratic pattern of use. That an erratic pattern, that can look like getting substances from different sources, which then have different qualities or potency levels, using different kinds of substances, using different times of the day, because our tolerance shifts throughout the day, using in different locations, different kinds of with different people, etc. The tolerance shifts quickly with opioids, and any inconsistency in the pattern of use can result in shifting tolerance levels, which increases overdose risk. The mixing of substances, so if the mixing of central nervous system depressants, or what is commonly known as downers, such as alcohol, other opioids, benzodiazepines, which is a class of medications used to treat anxiety, such as Xanax, that using downers together can really increase the potency of all of these and can increase the way that they depress breathing. And that an opioid overdose, that people die because of respiratory arrest, because they stop breathing. And then we'll talk a little bit later specifically about what are some of the specific risks to overdose of mixing with stimulants. So really mixing any substances here can increase overdose risk. Different physical health vulnerabilities, so any kinds of chronic, medical conditions or chronic illness or just illness in general can increase risk of overdose because of how illness impacts our ability to process substances, as well as vulnerabilities that may already exist in our systems or in our organs, especially any conditions that impact respiratory health, liver health, kidney health, cardiac health, and our natural defenses, such as an immunodeficiency. And so here, right, clearly we see how the pandemic itself increases overdose risk should anybody be experiencing any kind of respiratory infection. A pattern of impulsivity, a history of suicide, self-injury, depression, or depressed mood can all increase the likelihood of using in more erratic ways, which then, of course, increases overdose risk. A recent period of abstinence because our tolerance will have decreased. And this abstinence could be by choice, it could be intentional, or it could be unintentional, such as exiting an institution, such as exiting the hospital, exiting a nursing home, or exiting incarceration. The route of administration, how we get the drug into our body. More direct routes of administration, so lead to quicker absorption, which lead to higher levels of the substance in our system, which then, of course, increase the risk of overdose. That said, it's possible to overdose by any route of administration. Now, eating and swallowing a substance is the slowest route of administration, the slowest rate of absorption, but the risk here is that because it takes longer for somebody to experience the peak intoxicating effects of what they've eaten or swallowed, they may take more thinking that, they haven't reached enough of the effect. And so that can also be another way that the overdose risk comes up, even though it is a slow route of administration. Not having an overdose prevention plan. So being able to talk about our pattern of use, the potential overdose risk, and strategize about how to prevent fatal overdose, all of this supports someone in preventing in avoiding overdose to begin with, and then preventing that overdose from being fatal. And then, of course, if someone seeks profound intoxication, that is different from somebody who's just using a tiny amount of an opioid to just not be drug sick. That if somebody, which of course it's still possible to overdose, but if somebody is purposely seeking a profound intoxication, then they're typically using a higher amount. They're typically using a more direct route of administration, and they're typically less likely to test the dose or taste the dose, all of which increases overdose risk. So now I want to invite everyone to kind of practice identifying overdose risk factors. I'll read this out loud, and please go ahead and enter in the chat the overdose risk factors that you noticed. Kelly recently called seeking counseling services after experiencing physical abuse from her current partner. She shares with the intake specialist that she uses opioid pills and cannabis daily and is prescribed benzodiazepines for anxiety that she usually takes once or twice a week, but finds she's taken them daily recently because of heightened anxiety. She has a history of suicide attempts and depression. So here we see, right, the history of suicide attempts, the high anxiety and depression. Absolutely. The mixing of substances, of medications, physical abuse, yeah, the using of different substances, the domestic violence. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. So here I've put in bold the main kind of risk factors to hear. And so what are some additional things we would want to consider, both in general as well as in relation to Kelly's overdose risk factors? So first, what's her housing situation? Is her housing safe and stable? Since we know that unstable or unsafe housing is a risk factor for both recovery as well as overdose. Does she have any health conditions? And if so, does she have access to have the health care that she needs or desires? We know that physical health conditions are a risk factor, and something that is also true is that domestic violence also poses an increased risk for contracting HIV, hepatitis C, and other kinds of infections. What's her emotional support system look like, particularly with her experiences of suicide attempts and depression, and how domestic violence as well as substance use can often be very isolating? With whom does she tend to spend her time? Is she using alone, which we know is an overdose risk factor, or potentially using with people who are unsafe and may use her substance use to further victimize her, as we know that both using alone as well as substance use coercion are risk factors. And then, of course, what is she already doing to stay as safe as possible and prevent overdose? Does she have an overdose prevention plan and naloxone? Because we know that lack of overdose prevention plan and lack of naloxone are risk factors, and that for Kelly, collaborating, either having collaborative services or integrated services where we can both safety plan around overdose prevention as well as safety plan around the violence and the abuse will be really important for both preventing overdose as well as supporting her overall safety and recovery. So recognizing and responding to potential overdose. So first, signs of an opioid overdose. Here are the main signs. Some of the really the things to keep in mind is that in an opioid overdose, someone will be mostly unresponsive. So some of the things to keep in mind here is that the gray, purple, or blue lips or nails is that's due to lack of oxygen, and that the discoloration will be largely based on somebody's skin tone. So different complexions will show up as either gray, purple, or blue, depending on race and ethnicity. Something else to keep in mind here is what is the lighting in the environments where people are typically using. People many times may use in low lighting environments. And so if somebody is indoors and there's low lighting and they suspect an overdose, one of the first things that we can do, that we can coach someone doing, is turn on all the lights so you can actually see what's going on, see the person. Now, if somebody is using in an alley or in, kind of a public area at night, then they're not going to be able to turn on the lights, obviously. And then with difficulty breathing, gurgling sounds, or unusual snoring, that can typically, that can be confused for someone being asleep. And we want to make sure that people are aware of that so that they don't leave someone to sleep it off. Many people, unfortunately, have died to preventable overdose because somebody thought that they were sleeping. And then kind of the main kind of takeaway in being able to distinguish between profound intoxication and overdose is that somebody who's profoundly intoxicated will still respond. You can still give them a light shake, you can still call their name, and they will respond, be able to speak for a sentence or two before becoming very drowsy again. Whereas somebody who's experiencing an overdose will be unresponsive, may try to open eyes but not be able to, or may be able to open their eyes but not be able to speak, or may be able to speak but just only say like one word. So I have reversed overdoses on people who are only able to respond by saying their own name, or only able to respond by saying one word. But they're not able to respond to the actual questions that are being asked. They're not able to talk for a sentence or two. And one more thing to keep in mind here is that it can take hours for a person to overdose, particularly if they have more long-acting opioids or substances in their system, or it can take seconds, like in the presence of fentanyl. I remember in our treatment program, we had a gentleman walk in for an intake, and he was fixing himself a cup of coffee, and we were just saying, hello and good morning and how are you, and welcoming him. And he went from walking, talking, holding a conversation to on the ground, unresponsive within seconds. And it actually took several administrations of naloxone before the first responders got there, and the first responders went ahead and gave 2 more administrations of naloxone before he was responsive, and come to find out that this was due to the presence of fentanyl as well as benzodiazepines, neither of which he knew that he was using. So responding to a potential opioid overdose. So here is an acronym that can help facilitate learning. It is SCARE ME. Now, with the growing presence of fentanyl, it's also a good idea to just go ahead and administer naloxone right after calling for help, and then providing some rescue breaths after administering the naloxone so that we can get the naloxone moving in someone's system. But still, this can be a really helpful acronym for just kind of memorizing the different steps involved in responding to a potential overdose. So SCARE ME. The S is for simulation. It's I want everyone to go ahead and make a fist with their hand and then place their knuckles over their breastbone, over their sternum, so right in the middle of their chest, and just firmly grind back and forth. Now what you'll notice is that is a significant sensation. That is a firm sensation. That kind of hurts, right? And so it's not going to hurt the person, but if they're not responding to a light shake and a calling of their name, then go ahead and go towards what this is called the sternal rub. And that if they're not responding to this kind of grinding of the knuckles on the sternum, there's a good chance that they're non-responsive, that they're experiencing an overdose. Another place that you can go ahead and do this kind of knuckle grind is on the upper lip, just below the nose. That's another place that is going to feel particularly sensitive, not actually hurt the person, but is going to wake them up if they are arousable. From there, if they're not responsive, calling for help, calling 911, calling for an ambulance. If you are with other people, calling for them to get involved and get their help so that they can call 911 while you go towards, taking the next step. Now here, I would highly recommend that you just go ahead and administer naloxone. Naloxone comes in 3 different forms. We need to know the 3 different ways of administering naloxone so that you can both teach people how to administer naloxone, whatever form they have access to, as well as be able to use whatever kind of naloxone may be handy. Intramuscular injection is the most affordable and often because it's more affordable, often the most accessible kind. Now, intramuscular injection, some people can feel really wary around being able to give an injection. And what I'll say is that with support and training, it is very simple to give an injection of naloxone. You can go right through clothing. It's a very small injection. So it's really more the kind of initial fear that people have to, that people need support in overcoming. And there are some different ways and videos and ways of kind of practicing in order to help people get over that initial hump. There's the auto injector, which is walks you through and is very easy to use, also the most expensive form of naloxone. That said, I've certainly seen programs get special forms of funding and partner with the makers of the auto injector in order to create access to the auto injector. Then there's the nasal spray, which is not as affordable as the intramuscular injection, but not as expensive as the auto injector. And they provide special government pricing where where nonprofits and government entities can get it for about half of the retail cost. And so that can be more accessible for organizations particularly. And the nasal spray is super easy. It's so easy that the times that I've given it, I've asked myself, did it work? Did I do it? Did I actually give it? Did it happen? And then it's through, of course, the person reviving that I know that, thankfully reviving, that I know that it worked. So after calling for help, we want to go ahead and give the naloxone and then check the airway to make sure there's nothing obstructing their airway. Go ahead and give some rescue breaths. And then evaluate. Are they coming to? Every 2 to 3 minutes, they want to go ahead and administer naloxone again and then continue to give rescue breaths. Something that I got for all of my staff were these little I got them from Lifeguard Supply Company, and they cover somebody's face and have like a breathing little kind of place where you place over the mouth so that you can provide rescue breaths while also having a universal precautions protective barrier. And so all of our staff had them on their keychains for their work keys, and they're very, very affordable and easy to get, and they can just be part of your first aid kit as well. And then naloxone is available from a lot of different resources. And in Florida, you actually have a great resource that I'll be sure to touch on as well. So post-overdose support. We want to continue to support the person until the first responders arrive or up to 4 hours after the overdose. Naloxone can wear off and the person can overdose again. Now, a person can experience some pretty intense withdrawal after being revived with naloxone and may feel really confused about what's just happened, may want to use again in order to curb the withdrawal they're feeling. And so we do need to both provide emotional support as well as prevent them from using more substances in that moment because the naloxone can wear off and they can overdose again. And then seeking medical support. Something medical has happened. Medical support is needed. There could be other substances in our system that are contributing to the overdose, and naloxone only works on opioids. That said, Good Samaritan laws exist in Florida, and so people can seek emergency medical care without being prosecuted for possession of substances. So it's something that's important for people to know. Now, talking specifically about opioids and stimulants. In 2017, opioids were present in 75% of overdoses related to cocaine and 50% of overdoses related to methamphetamine. Now, people may have been using, we don't know whether people are using these substances together on purpose. We do know that mixing substances increases overdose risk, or if a person is using substances that they don't know has an opioid in it. So because of the presence of fentanyl, people may be using cocaine or methamphetamine and not know that there was fentanyl in it, there was an opioid in it. And that naloxone is only going to be effective for reversing overdoses due to an opioid. And this is where fentanyl testing can become especially important. So fentanyl testing can be helpful to be able to detect the presence of fentanyl in opioids or in stimulants or other substances as well. And there's growing evidence that people will take different kinds of harm reduction steps to mitigate the potential for overdose once they know that there's fentanyl in their substances. So they'll either choose not to use it if it's something that they didn't, want to use fentanyl, that they, are using are seeking to use MDMA, and then they find out there's fentanyl in it. Sometimes people will just say, nope, don't want to use it at all. Other times they'll be sure to use with naloxone kit and take turns using or make sure they're not alone. So there's evidence showing that people make much safer choices in order to prevent accidental fatal overdose once they know that there's fentanyl present in their drug supply. And that fentanyl testing strips can be really easy for us as providers to get online. We can just purchase it. They're very affordable. And that's something that we can offer in a way to support people to prevent overdose. Now, talking about overdose that's related to stimulants, that is not opioid related. And sometimes this is known as overamping. So overamping is a stimulant-related overdose. So some things that can help prevent overamping is drinking water, eating food, sleeping, breathing exercises, and soothing activities. And then the severe signs and health issues of overamping are these. So if any of these come up, then what is really needed is emergency medical care. And so here you'll see just a lot of, potential like cardiac pieces, right, coming up for folks. And so what can we do? Seek emergency medical care. There's no single overdose antidote, like naloxone can reverse an opioid overdose. And that emergency medical care is going to focus on treating or preventing heart attack, stroke, and organ shutdown. And another part of preventing overdose or overamping and stimulant use is just overall health promotion. So the prevention and treatment of HIV and hepatitis C, reproductive health care, safer sex materials and condom negotiation, supporting eating and nutrition and hydration, especially before using and while coming down, engaging in routine health care, and of course, access to behavioral health care. So what not to do during an overdose? We want to be sure not to shame or put down what people have tried in their attempts to save lives. The misinformation about what to do to save someone's life who may be overdosing is not the fault of community members, but reflects the stigma against people who use drugs and how hard it is to find information that is accurate and not based on scare tactics. So we honor what people have done as they try to save lives. And here's some information about what is not helpful during a potential overdose. Don't put the person in a bath, they could drown. Don't put ice on them, they could go into shock. Don't induce vomiting or give them something to eat or drink, they could choke. Don't give medications, over-the-counter drugs, stimulants, street drugs, caffeine, or vitamins. The only thing you should give someone who might be overdosing is naloxone if it seems to be an opioid-related overdose, because these other things don't help, they delay time, and they're more likely to choke. Do not try to walk them around in hopes of waking them up. You could trip, you could fall down and get hurt. It doesn't work, it just wastes time. Don't leave the person to sleep it off, and don't run away. It's very understandable that our fight or flight gets triggered in these situations, and that's where education around this and talking about this is so important so that people don't just feel scared and run away. And then trauma-informed follow-up. Follow up with the person who overdosed. Neutralize shame, support overdose prevention planning. Provide emotional support for anyone who is involved in responding to the overdose. Follow up with staff. Create space for checking in and accessing support. And if someone was lost to overdose, honor those whom we've lost. Honor their lives. Celebrate their lives. And if there's any kind of closing paperwork that's needed, supervisors or directors need to offer support by taking care of that paperwork so that the person who is directly engaged in the care is not, we're not setting them up for kind of re-traumatization by having to take care of that paperwork all by themselves. And then providing overdose education. So whenever I provide overdose education and go through kind of like risk factors and responding to overdose, I usually will say to folks, and now you are ready to save someone else's life. But now let's talk about who you're going to share this information with so that someone else would be able to save your life, because the life you save will not be your own. So, who can provide overdose education? All of us can provide overdose education. So with proper training and support, any one of us can be prepared to offer overdose education and distribute naloxone. Medical expertise is not needed, and that research has found that overdose education and response provided by lay people, so non-medical community members, including people who use drugs, is an important tool in preventing fatal overdoses. So key steps: building trustworthy relationships. So keeping that door open to discuss substances and meeting people where they are, providing non-judgmental and non-coercive education around overdose risk and prevention. And here's one way to provide overdose prevention education in a way that is participatory, that is a conversation, and that is motivational. That this actually comes from motivational interviewing. And it's called elicit, provide, elicit. So the first elicit is just getting a sense of what somebody's already doing in order to stay safe. What do they already know about overdose prevention, or what are their thoughts on overdose prevention? And then from there, with permission, moving into providing information. Now, when we start by asking people what they already know, it gives us the opportunity to first be strengths-based, to build on what they're already doing, what they already know. That also helps us avoid telling them what they already know, because people, all of us tend to kind of tune out when people are telling us what's something we already know. It also helps us uncover any potential myths and misconceptions around how to prevent overdose that then we can help clarify during the provide part of the conversation. So here, with permission, would it be all right if I shared some information about XYZ with you? I have some information on naloxone here that you might find relevant. Can I share that with you? And what's fascinating is that when we ask for their permission, they actually tend to listen much more deeply. And they tend to take in the information and engage the information in a much deeper way. And if people say, no, that's not where I'm at all, or I already know all about that, I don't want to hear about that, that's super important for us to hear so that we can meet them where they are and provide information and resources that are relevant to them. Because otherwise, what we're really contributing to is their disengagement. And then the most important part, the final elicit. This is where the rubber meets the road. where we find out what are they going to do with the information and the conversation that we've just had. So we can find out their reactions to what we've just, the information we've provided. We can ask what might be helpful to know. And then we can also ask, my favorite question of all time is, what do you think you'll do? How would you like to move forward? And so we naturally flow into that planning aspect of really applying the information. So key steps in overdose prevention planning: creating the overdose prevention plan, accessing the lock zone, recognizing risk factors and strategizing around how to mitigate those risk factors, knowing that our tolerance changes, starting low, so starting with a small amount and increasing the amount we are using slowly, avoiding mixing, avoiding using alone, and keeping the lock zone kit handy. Now, in your naloxone kit, the things that are required are quite simple. You need naloxone, and you need written instructions on what to do. Because any one of us, doesn't matter how many times we've reversed an overdose, when we're in the moment, we can have a sense of panic, and it's important to kind of have that information really straightforward and handy. Now, a naloxone kit that we keep on site, that as staff, 2 doses of naloxone is enough. Now, if we're in an area that is either, it's going to take a long time for first responders to get there, or we're handing out kits to people, then we want there to be 3 doses in the naloxone kit. Because with the presence of fentanyl, there are situations where more than 2 doses are needed, and the last thing we want to have happen is for there to be multiple people overdosing and only 1 naloxone kit or not enough naloxone, right? And then the optional items include rescue breathing masks, rubber gloves, and alcohol pads. Rubber gloves, always nice to have in case you have to clean anything up or, there's any kind of body spill. And alcohol pads, I say are real give or take, because the con of alcohol pads is that people then in the moment can get confused and think that in order to give an intramuscular injection, they have to get down to the skin, and that's not the case. You can give a naloxone injection through clothing. So we don't want to waste precious time. And then, as I mentioned earlier, naloxone availability decreases fatal overdose and does not increase rates of use. Prescribers can prescribe naloxone without any additional waiver. Naloxone is as non-toxic as water. It's safe for people who are pregnant and may be overdosing. It's safe for infants and toddlers who may have gotten into a medicine cabinet. And it may be available through kind of local administrations. And I'll actually give you the specific place to go to in Florida. And I'll say, keep calm and carry naloxone. So iSafe Florida Overdose Prevention is an amazing resource that you have right there in your state. And through iSafe Florida, you can access naloxone. You can submit requests through the website, and it'll be directly mailed to you. You can become a naloxone distribution site, as well as get trained on naloxone and overdose response. And here you have both the URL to their main website, as well as the URL directly to their naloxone. Some additional resources in harm reduction and overdose prevention that are specific to this pandemic. Well, the overdose prevention worksheet, which is a great worksheet, both to learn as a practitioner as well as to use with people in our services. That comes from the Harm Reduction Coalition, and that's not specific to the pandemic. But then there is the COVID-19 guidance for bridge programs and MAT services from the Public Health Institute that is specific to the pandemic. Some additional naloxone information and resources. And then some additional harm reduction and overdose prevention resources that are specific to the pandemic. So the COVID-19 guidance for people who use drugs and harm reduction programs from the Harm Reduction Coalition, practicing harm reduction in COVID-19 outbreak from Vital Strategies, and then the COVID-19 guidance for people who use substances that is a collaborative, and you see there all the collaborative partners. our references for today. And then please be sure to sign up for our newsletter so you can find out any of our new offerings. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me with questions and any new resources that you become aware of. I'd love to hear from folks. And then some additional resources from our center. We have a whole website dedicated to mental health, substance use treatment, and recovery support services providers. We have our substance use and mental health coercion toolkit for primary care and behavioral health settings, as well as our opioid policy paper, research and policy brief, and then our trauma-informed care toolkit, which is becoming accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations. I want to thank everyone for your time today, and then open it up if we might have time for maybe one question. And otherwise, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Gabriella. If you have questions, this is a good time to go ahead and post those in our chat real quick. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, I'll say thank you so much to everyone. Thank you so much for everything you do every day in combating these horrific epidemics and the unnecessary loss of life, and helping people build lives of recovery. We know that it's hard, but it's worth it, right? So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Gabriella. You shared a wealth of information, and we do appreciate your time. And we'd also like to thank you for participating in today's webinar, and we'd like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day, and please hold for our evaluation. Thank you.